Hey everyone, Hellhog here, or you may know me as Aeyix on the Shadowlands. I wanted to make an updated version of my 3.0 Hatred Assassin Guide. This time, I'm also making a Republic side version. If you'd like the Serenity Shadow version of this guide, you can find that, as well as the Deception, Infiltration, Mercenary, and Commando guides in the description below or on my YouTube channel. This guide will focus on the PvE side of Hatred Assassin, and is broken up into 6 parts. Timestamps to the separate parts can be found in the description below if you'd like to skip ahead. 6 parts are Hatred's purpose and usefulness in flashpoints and operations, a gearing overview, utilities overview, an abilities overview, the rotation, and finally an example dummy parse. Let's get started. Overall, Hatred in operations and flashpoints is a mixed bag. There are some great cooldowns and AoE available, but unfortunately it lacks the passive damage reduction necessary to make it worth taking in the hardest of content. It's one of the lowest single target parsing classes in the game, as well as one of the squishiest, if not the squishiest. It lacks any type of further passive damage reduction outside of its light armor, and relies on passive self-heals from its rotation to make up for it. Hatred also has no area of effect damage reduction, which in some harder fights is make or break. It does, however, have a 15% damage reduction from periodic effects, however that does not bring the class into too much favor. To put things into perspective, I was playing my Marauder the other day, which is significantly less geared, and I'm less skilled at than my Assassin. On average, I was parsing higher, if not even, with my Assassin, and survivability was much simpler. Not to mention I brought more utility to the raid as well with Predation and Bloodthirst. Assassin is perfectly viable in any hard mode flashpoint as well as hard mode operation. However, once you get to the Nightmare tier, some bosses are practically impossible with Hatred unless your group is better built around you specifically. Hatred lacks any sort of burst. Where it does succeed, however, is sustained AoE damage. This ability to continually refresh dots on adds and even refresh dots on the boss from the adds without ever reapplying dots is fantastic. Especially with the fact that one of your rotational abilities in of itself is AoE. Don't let the negatives of the class deter you though. It is fantastic to play and quite powerful in the right hands. Just keep in mind that many progression raid groups may require you to play another class for Nightmare content, and even sometimes hard mode content. Before you go any further with this guide, if you haven't done so yet, I highly recommend you go through and read all the tooltips and descriptions in your discipline and abilities pane, so that you are familiar with the class, its buffs, abilities, and cooldowns. Now let's discuss gearing. For those watching from my shadow guides, don't be alarmed that I'm on an assassin. Gearing for assassins and shadows is exactly the same, and for the ease of simplicity and be able to show what I want, I'm on my assassin since it's better geared. If you're looking for further theory crafting and discussion on gearing, I highly recommend checking out Ban's forum thread over on the SWTOR forums over gearing in 4.0. It's a great resource of information. If you have questions, you might be able to get them answered there. There'll be a link to that page in the description below for those interested in seeing that. Now let's get started on the actual gearing discussion. First and foremost, we want to be sure we're using a double-bladed weapon, as well as a force focus, as this provides the most force power and melee damage possible for an assassin, as well as allows us to use all our abilities. Second thing is, since this is PvE, we want to make sure we hit our accuracy cap, and the reason for this is bosses have a 10% native defense resist chance. So by having 110% force and 110% melee accuracy, we won't miss at all, which will increase our DPS significantly. We do this in 2 ways. We get a companion buff, and then we hit 684 accuracy rating. You're probably wondering, what's the companion buff? Well, if you don't know what the companion buffs are, if you go to your legacy pane, under global unlocks, Imperial or Republic classes, you'll notice that if you complete conversation lines with a companion, you get a buff to your stats, whether it's crit, healing received, health, or most importantly, accuracy. The nice thing is, you only have to do this once. So let's say you've completed talking to Scorpio with your agent, or you've completed talking to Scourge with your bounty hunter, then all your characters on your legacy will have a 1% accuracy increase. Even your smuggler will have it now, even though maybe you haven't but just started your smuggler and haven't finished talking with any of these. So I highly recommend getting all your companion buffs, especially the accuracy one, as that's vital to your stats. You'll be able to spec less into accuracy, put more into alacrity and crit, thus increasing your DPS further. So the way we get that second part, the 684 rating, is twofold. You can use my method, which was the most common method until they came out with proficient stims. But if you're using a versatile stim, which provides mastery and power stat, then you use 2 initiative enhancements, which is the best in slot accuracy enhancement available, as well as 5 accuracy augments. This will put you in 220 or 224 gear, above the 604 accuracy rating with minimal stat wasted. The reason I use this still is because I PvP, so switching between PvE and PvP, it's a lot easier, not to mention the fact that I was already kind of geared toward this to begin with, and I didn't want to change when they came out with proficient stims. Now, since you're new in your gearing, or maybe you're thinking about changing your gearing that you've already established, the other method is using a proficient stim instead of a mastery stim, so you trade off the mastery and power for accuracy and crit. You still need 2 initiative enhancements, but now instead of 5 augments, you use only 2 augments, and then you can put those other 3 augments into other tertiary stats of your desire. But doing any of those in 220 or 224 gear will give you your accuracy cap. You won't be able to miss against the boss, and that's greatly important. Now, for actual gearing, for the set bonus, we want the Stalker set bonus. That's the one that applies to Assassin and Shadows, and that's what will buff all our different abilities for auto crits or doing more damage or decrease cooldowns. So make sure you get that one. Now, I told you you want 2 accuracy enhancements, the initiative enhancements, regardless of which method you choose, and you get that through 3 slots. You can get it through your hands, your boots, and your offhand. Now, as an assassin, there is an alternative to the offhand. We can use the SWTOR healer offhand called Force Healer, and I highly recommend you do that. This way you don't have 3 accuracy enhancements when getting your gear, you only have 2, and so you're not having to do more min-maxing of your gear. It makes it much easier. So make sure you get the Force Healer offhand while you get the Stalker for everything else. You'll get 1 alacrity piece throughout your gear, and that comes in the headpiece. I have one in my chest piece, which required me to do a little min-maxing. I don't recommend that. If you want to get more alacrity through enhancement slots, then the easiest way is to make sure you get an alacrity earpiece or implants. Now, the way I gear, once I hit my accuracy cap for Assassins and Shadows, whether you're playing Deception Infiltration or Hatred Serenity, so I like to get about 900 alacrity, 1200 critical rating. I personally am doing that through the 2 alacrity enhancements that I mentioned. The 2 accuracy enhancements, then everything else is crit. Then for augmenting, I have the 5 accuracy augments, I have 1 critical augment, and then everything else is alacrity. So you can do what you prefer. I found that this works best for me regardless of the discipline I play. I did some testing with power augments, with mastery augments, with less alacrity and more crit, and I found that in the end this is what worked best for me. What works best for you might be different, so I recommend you test out what you like, but for a baseline, definitely hit your accuracy cap, and then highly recommend around 900 alacrity, 1200 crit, and then kind of adjust it from there. Don't augment for mastery. The amount of crit that you get from mastery at this point is hitting hard diminishing returns. If you're gonna augment that type of stat, go for power instead. However, like I said, I don't recommend it. It doesn't work for me. Might work for you. But that's gearing in a nutshell for both Deception Infiltration and Hatred Serenity, Assassins and Shadows. Choosing utilities for Hatred and PvE is on a fight-by-fight basis in most circumstances. I like to take Avoidance for the 5-second quicker cooldown on Force Speed. Oppressing Force is PvP, so we don't bother with it too much. Shapeless Spirit is very situational. There are some fights where you will be stunned and you'll be taking significant amount of damage while stunned, so it's worth taking from that aspect for extra survivability. Obfuscation is nice to have. You move a little bit faster, and as a melee class, range is everything. You can still drop it at times, as 15% isn't huge, but if you're not using any other utility, it's worth taking. Lambast is absolutely worth taking if you're going to be doing AoE and you're going to be dot spreading. It increases the damage of your lacerate and thus increases your DPS. In almost all fights, I'll take Insulation. When you're in 224 gear, that 30% armor rating increase equates out to a 4.5% damage reduction increase to kinetic energy. Electric Bindings is mostly situational, but it's also mostly PvP, so don't worry about it for the most part. Snarling Slashes is PvP, so we don't worry about it at all. At the Masterful tier, Disjunction is great. It increases your Force Speed time and your Force Shroud time, so I take it for most fights. Static Cling is PvP, so we don't worry about it at all. Fade is situational. If you need Force Cloak as a stealth out, or as a stealth out shroud, Combined with Shroud of Madness, then it's worth taking if you need to do it more often. Otherwise, I typically don't take it. Nerve-wracking is PvP, so we don't worry about it. Immersion is situational. If there's any roots that can be cleansed, it's worth taking. It's more so PvP focused. Some people like it for fights like Underlurker, but I find the speed boost from Force Speed is enough already that you don't need immersion on top of it. Sapped Mine is PvP, so we don't worry about it. Audacity grants an extra charge of Recklessness, therefore it increases DPS, so it's worth taking in most situations. Speed Surge is very situational. It'll help you move around quicker overall, more so than Obfuscation, but it requires you use a Masterful point instead of being able to put one into Skillful, so it's very situational on when to use it. At the Heroic tier, Magnetism is PvP, so we don't bother with it at all. Assassin Shelter is semi-useful. It helps your healers slightly, but it's not significant. It's not as good against single big hits as it is against high amounts of trickle damage incoming, as it will increase damage reduction for 6 seconds instead of 1 hit, like Sonic Wall and Sonic Rebounder. And the healing it does is only 2k over the duration at level 65. Haunted Dreams is PvP mostly, so we don't worry about it. However, it does have its uses in some fights, but the fact that it's only an 8-second stun, not 60 seconds, makes it less useful than other classes. Dark Stability is again situational. There are certain periods where there is a stun or sleep that you can prevent by using Deflection. However, it's far and few, so again, situational. It's mostly a PvP utility. Hand of Darkness is PvP, so we don't worry about it at all. Shroud of Madness is nice to have when we stealth out. It's an extra bit of Force Shroud. Not to mention, combined with Disjunction, it actually makes the stealth out Shroud last 4 seconds, not 2. Gate Manipulation is again situational, and it's mostly PvP, so we don't worry about it too much. With all our other speed boosts that we have, it's not as necessary. Phasing Phantasm is again situational. However, with certain purges that we have available, it's not as necessary. It's more so a PvP ability. So for the most part, this is what I choose in a fight where I'm playing Hatred, especially if there's AoE to be done. If there isn't AoE to be done, I'll take Lambast and put it into something like Assassin Shelter, Fade, or Shapeless Spirit. If there is AoE to be done, but I need the point somewhere else, then I'll take Obfuscation away and put it into Shapeless Spirit, Fade, or Assassin Shelter. But in most circumstances, this is what I use utility-wise for Hatred Assassin. Next thing to go over for Hatred Assassin is our offensive and defensive cooldowns available to us. Our purest offensive cooldown is Recklessness, that when popped will give us 2 charges of Recklessness, 3 if using the Audacity utility. Recklessness charges will only burn on Death Field and Demolish in your rotation, but your other dots will not use a charge of Recklessness. We also have Overcharged Saber available to us that when used instantly returns 15% of our health. It also increases the chance that our lightsaber charges hit and the amount of damage that they hit for, and when they do hit, it heals us for a small percentage of our health. So now we have pure defensive cooldowns available to us. Our first one, our biggest one, that we'll use the most often is our Mass Mind Control, which is our area taunt. However, it's a threat drop when playing Hatred. When activated, it activates Nefarious Methods, which gives us a 30% damage reduction to all types. We have Force Shroud, that when used, gives us 3 seconds, 5 seconds with Disjunction, of 200% Force Tech resistance. You can also activate Force Shroud by Force Cloaking if you're using the Shroud of Madness utility. Force Cloak is also a utility in a fight. You can use it to stealth out and battle res somebody, but while playing Hatred, you have to make sure your dots are no longer ticking on any of the active bosses in a phase, and then you can stealth out. So as you see, it activates Force Shroud, and assuming you had no dots ticking, it'll put you out of combat and you can stealth res somebody. Last we have is Deflection, which increases for 12 seconds our melee ranged defense chance by 50%, as you can see here. And the 3 cooldowns that we have left are all gap closers. So we have Force Speed, has a 25-second cooldown with the avoidance utility, or 30 seconds normally. Increases our force speed by 150%. We have Phase Walk, which you can use while DPSing. As I'll note here, I'll start spamming, and you can use Phase Walk in the middle because it's off global cooldown. Then I can run away, and you can use it within 60 meters of your target to return. And last, we have Phantom Stride, which will increase your movement speed by 75% for 3 seconds. And in Hatred, it'll also proc Bloodletting automatically, which will give us an instant assassinate above 30% health. So that covers all the offensive and defensive cooldowns available to Hatred Assassin. Before we finally get into an example parse for Hatred, I want to briefly go over the rotation. You can pause the video here to read this if you'd like. I'll also include a link in the description so you can download this. The Hatred rotation mostly follows a priority system. However, there is a maximum efficiency rotation that can be done to try and maximize DPS. The max efficiency rotation is very difficult to maintain on most bosses aside from Nephra. To start off, we want to make sure we're in lightning charge stance. For our opener, when we can, we try to precast Demolish, which requires us to be in 10 meter range, and typically we start from stealth, just so we don't pull the boss. In periods though where we cannot do this, we either just skip to the next item in line, or we can replace it with Creeping Terror. We will then Phantom Stride to the boss, so we're in melee range, and we proc our Bloodletting right away, so we don't have bad RNG where Bloodletting doesn't proc in time for Assassinate. We use Recklessness for extra DPS, and if we don't need it within the first 2 minutes of the fight as a defensive cooldown, we'll use Overcharged Saber. From there, we just follow the rest of these abilities going into our rotation. Leeching Strike will proc our 2-piece set bonus, Thresh will proc our 6-piece, and ideally this will be an auto-crit Assassinate during a double relic proc. Now if you don't have the APM and Alacrity necessary, or you want a better guarantee that that auto-crit Assassinate is in a double relic proc, the alternative thing you can do is move Leeching Strike in the opener to where Assassinate is, and move these 4 abilities up 1 GCD. They'll better guarantee a double relic proc auto-crit Assassinate, however you won't have the 2% damage bonus from the 2-piece set bonus from Leeching Strike. If that happens, the Leeching Strike further in the rotation is replaced with Thrash, and once you go into the efficiency rotation, Leeching Strike will fall into the 2nd and 10th spot in the first pass and not the 6th spot, essentially alternating what you currently see on the efficiency rotation. Before I dive any further into the rotation, I want to talk about our rotation goals. We want to try and Deathfield and Leeching Strike on cooldown as much as possible. We want to Demolish on proc, but we can delay it upwards of 2 GCDs. Holding it any further though risks pushing off any procs as well as clipping Demolish. We do not need to Assassinate right away. It can be held and should be held for higher priority attacks. The only exception to this is when the boss has less than 30% health and we're in the next execution phase. We want to maintain 100% uptime on our Creeping Terror and Discharge dots, and as well try and keep a 3 GCD spread between them to allow for better rotation efficiency. Lastly, as an advanced tip, if you're able to maintain mechanics while looking at your buff bar, try as much as possible to not use Saber Strike during relic procs and instead use Assassinate Thrash. Ideally this will lead to more damage, however you have to be careful that you don't run into any force issues by doing so. You need a Saber Strike to manage your force, especially for periods where you have lots of force use abilities, such as here that you see Leeching Strike, Deathfield, and Creeping Terror all in order. Having to delay one of those because you don't have enough force will throw off your efficiency rotation. So for our priority for our rotation, we pretty much follow this as you see here. You Deathfield on cooldown, you Demolish on proc, you maintain uptime on Discharge and Creeping Terror dots, Leeching Strike on cooldown, and then you follow your filler priority for your melee attacks, where Assassinate's highest priority and Saber Strike's lowest priority to maintain force. When we get into the sub 30% health phase of a boss though, Assassinate moves from the 6th spot in the priority all the way up to the top spot. And the reasoning for this is Assassinate will be used very frequently, and when it comes on cooldown we don't want to delay it because then we could lose a cooldown to a proc, or the more we delay a proc, the longer we have to wait for it to come off cooldown. So for our efficiency rotation, we look at it from the point of view of our dots. Our dots are 18 seconds or 12 GCDs long, so we base our rotation on a 12 GCD rotation. This leaves Discharge and Creeping Terror always maintaining the same point in the rotation. Death Field, since it has a 15-second cooldown, will move back 2 GCDs or 3 seconds every pass through the rotation. Because of where we put Leeching Strike though, Leeching Strike and Death Field will never collide in the rotation, meaning we can always use them on cooldown. Demolish is in the 1st and the 7th spot and will collide with Death Field, however we can delay Demolish 2 GCDs as mentioned earlier, so we never have to mess up any Demolish procs, and essentially are using that perfectly as well. Lastly, this just leaves our melee priority, where we just follow our melee priority listed here, and we need to make sure though that we have enough force going into larger ports of the rotation as mentioned earlier, where you have a lot of force use abilities in a row. So for our situational attacks, since we are a melee class, we'll find times where we cannot DPS because we're outside of melee range. When that happens, we want to use our rotational abilities that are more than 4 meters. Once those are all exhausted though, our options are to use Force Lightning if no mobility is required. And if we do have to be mobile, then we can use Shock, Force Slow, or Electrocute. If we're stuck outside of 10 meters though, a lot of our force abilities can no longer be used, and our options are to try and use Death Field on the boss by clipping it, if we're within 15 meters. We can spam Creeping Terror since it deals damage on application, and then if we're stuck outside of 10 meters for a long period of time, our other alternative is to use Recklessness plus Force Lightning, which gives us up to 30 meter range. Lastly, Hatred is a very good AoE discipline, has very strong powerful AoE that's very spammable. Our goal with our AoE rotation is to try and use Death Field on as many targets as possible, and to also make sure at least one of our targets within that AoE range has Discharge or Creeping Terror on it. Now, both dots don't have to be on the same target. As long as each dot is present, then we can spread them all. And we spread them by using Lacerate. We can use this as our main ability as well if there are 3 or more targets. If there's less than 3 targets, then we just want to go into our single rotation on whoever our primary focus is. We then go back to Lacerate to spread dots further, and to reapply dots to targets where the dots fall off, assuming the dots are still up on other targets. And then we continue to Death Field when it comes off cooldown. And that's pretty much the Hatred rotation in a nutshell. And now the moment you've all been waiting for, unless you skipped ahead of course, and that's the Hatred Assassin example Parse. Before I get started, just some quick things to go over. In the bottom left, I'll have a keyboard showing the keystrokes I'm pressing. In the top right, I'll have Star Parse showing you stats for the Parse, as well as SWTOR showing the abilities I'm using. If you want to see the Parse in more detail, there'll be a link to it in the description below. Just real quick, I'm going to flash my character sheet again so you can see the stats, even though I showed it earlier in the video. Now before we do any parsing, we want to make sure we use an armor reduction module on the dummy, as well as a health modulator. In most cases, you should use the 1.5 mil modulator, however I'm going to use a 1 mil for time purposes. So let's go ahead and get started. I usually like the double saber strike here, coming out of the opener. That's also when an adrenal would have ended. And it allows you to thrash here for the double relic proc. Oop, a little bit of lag. So I'm saving off Assassinate to try and have it for a relic proc, but unfortunately they proc too late. But I can use it here, which is nice. So here's where we're going to play Demolish for 2 GCDs. So as we get close to the execution phase, next time assassinating procs, you want to try and use it early. One thing to note, as the dummy gets low on health, we don't want to be reapplying dots, as it'll be a waste. So at this point, I'm no longer going to reapply Discharge or Terror. And there you have it. That was an example of Hatred Assassin Parse. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this guide to be helpful. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to put them in the comment section below and I'll try to respond as quickly as possible. Feel free to share this video, and as always, may the Force serve you well.